The morning sun barely touched the ancient walls of the palace when Camilla stood by the window, her reflection showing a woman who had weathered decades of scrutiny. She watched the gardens below, where gardeners trimmed hedges with the same precision they had maintained for centuries. Charles entered the room behind her, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He had come to discuss the upcoming state dinner, but something in her posture made him pause. "We need to talk," she said without turning around. Her voice carried a weight that made the Prince of Wales stop mid-stride. In all their years together, through scandal and eventual acceptance, he had rarely heard this tone from her. The story of Charles and Camilla had begun so many years ago, when they were both young and full of dreams. They met at a polo match in 1970, where Camilla Shand, as she was then known, approached the young prince with a boldness that caught him off guard. She had laughed and said her great-grandmother had been the mistress of his great-great-grandfather, King Edward VII. "So how about it?" she had asked with a mischievous smile. That moment sparked something that would endure through marriages to other people, public humiliation, and, eventually, redemption. But now, standing in that ornate room filled with portraits of his ancestors, Camilla turned to face him. Her eyes held something he couldn't quite read. Was it resignation, determination, or perhaps a mixture of both? "I've been thinking about everything," she began, her hands clasped in front of her. "About what we've built, what we've sacrificed, and what lies ahead." Charles moved to speak, but she raised her hand gently. "Please let me finish." The palace staff, always present yet invisible, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The usual bustle of morning activities grew quieter, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Camilla walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. "Do you remember what you told me when Diana died?" she asked. Charles's face changed, the memory still painful after all these years. "You said that timing was everything, that we had to wait, be patient, let the world heal." She paused, looking at a portrait of the late Princess of Wales that hung in a distant corner. "We waited. We were patient. The world moved on." Charles shifted uncomfortably. He remembered those dark days all too well. The public hatred directed at both of them, the blame, the accusations. Camilla had endured death threats, constant media harassment, and the cold shoulder from much of the establishment. Yet she had stayed, supporting him from the shadows, never complaining publicly, always maintaining her dignity. "But, Charles," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "waiting has become our entire existence. We wait for approval, we wait for the right moment, we wait for permission to simply be ourselves." She moved to the desk where official papers lay scattered, running her fingers along the edge. "I received a letter yesterday from my grandson. He asked me why some people still call me names in the newspapers." The prince's jaw tightened. Despite their eventual marriage in 2005 and her gradual acceptance by the public, there remained pockets of resistance. People who would never forgive what they saw as the betrayal of Diana's memory. "What did you tell him?" Charles asked softly. "I told him that sometimes adults make complicated choices and that not everyone understands or agrees with those choices." She looked directly at him. "But I'm tired of explaining our lives, Charles. Tired of justifying our love." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had fought so hard to be together, enduring separation, scandal, and scrutiny. When they finally married, it felt like a victory against the odds. Camilla had worked tirelessly to carve out her role, championing causes close to her heart, particularly domestic violence awareness and literacy. She had won over many critics with her warmth, humor, and dedication to duty. Yet here they stood, years later, still dealing with the echoes of the past. Charles approached her, reaching for her hand, but she stepped back slightly. "There's something else," she said. "Something I've never told you." The prince froze, uncertain what could possibly be left unsaid between them after all this time. "The night before our wedding, I almost didn't go through with it." Charles felt the air leave his lungs. That night, he remembered her being nervous but determined. They had joked about the media circus, about the protests planned by Diana loyalists, about the complicated arrangements that had been made to appease various factions. But doubt? He had never sensed doubt. Why? He managed to ask. Because I knew what I was signing up for, she replied. Not just the public role, but the private burden. Being with you means never quite being first in anyone's eyes. There's always the shadow of what was, what might have been. Your mother tolerates me. The institution accepts me because it has to. But true embrace? That's remained elusive. The Queen's gradual warming to Camilla had been a long process. From refusing to attend their wedding to eventually granting her the title of princess consort, and then indicating she should be queen consort when Charles became king. It had been a journey marked by careful steps and protocol. But Camilla was right. Tolerance and acceptance were not the same as embrace. I've given everything, Camilla continued, her voice cracking slightly for the first time. My reputation, my privacy, my children's peace of mind. And I would do it again because I love you. But I need to know, when does it end? When do we stop apologizing for finding each other? Charles felt the weight of her words. He thought of all the times he had asked her to wait, to understand, to be patient. The times he had put duty before their relationship, even after they were married. The careful choreography required for every public appearance. Always mindful of how things would be perceived, always aware of the ghosts that haunted their union. What are you saying? He asked, though he feared he already knew. I'm saying that I can't live the rest of my life as an apology, she stated firmly. Either we move forward as equals, truly equals, or... She trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The palace seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour, its sound carrying through the corridors like a countdown. Charles stood frozen, processing what felt like an ultimatum from the woman who had never made demands, who had always understood the complexities of his position. You want me to choose, he said slowly. No, Camilla shook her head. I want you to have already chosen. But if you haven't, if you're still torn between what you think you owe the past and what you could have in the future, then yes, I suppose I'm asking you to choose. She walked past him toward the door, pausing at the threshold. I'll be at Ray Mill House for the weekend. I need to think. Ray Mill House, her private retreat, the place she went when the pressures of royal life became too much. It was her sanctuary, purchased before their marriage, a symbol of the independence she had fought to maintain. Camilla, wait, Charles called out, but she had already turned back to face him. It's too late now, she said quietly, but with devastating clarity. Too late for half measures, too late for compromises. We're not young anymore, Charles. We don't have time for anything less than complete honesty. The words echoed through the palace as she left, reverberating off walls that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas. But this was different. This wasn't about succession or scandal or protocol. This was about two people who had defied convention to be together, now facing the question of whether that defiance had been worth the cost. Staff members who happened to be in the corridors stepped aside as Camilla passed, noting the unusual set of her shoulders, the determination in her stride. Word spread quickly, as it always did in the palace. The Duchess was leaving for the country. Alone, in his study, Charles sank into a chair, surrounded by the trappings of a life dedicated to duty. Photographs covered every surface, his sons, his grandchildren, his parents, and yes, Camilla. Always Camilla, smiling at him from silver frames, a constant presence in his carefully ordered world. He thought about their journey, how they had met when neither was free to pursue what they felt, how she had married Andrew Parker Bowles while he was away on naval duty, breaking his heart, how he had married Diana, hoping to do the right thing, only to cause more heartbreak. The intercepted phone calls, the leaked conversations, the public humiliation they had both endured when their affair became public knowledge. But he also remembered the joy, the shared laughter, the understanding that passed between them without words, the companionship that had sustained him through his darkest moments. Camilla had been his harbor in every storm, never asking for more than he could give, always understanding the impossible position he occupied. Now she was asking for something he wasn't sure he knew how to give, the ability to put their relationship first, without qualification or caveat. As news of Camilla's departure spread through the palace, advisors began to appear, each with opinions about damage control, about messaging, about the implications for the monarchy. Charles waved them away. This wasn't a matter for communication strategies or public relations. This was about a man and a woman who had paid every price society could extract and were now wondering if the bill was finally settled. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the palace grounds, Charles stood at the same window where Camilla had stood that morning. The gardeners had finished their work, leaving everything perfectly manicured, not a leaf out of place. But perfection, he realized, could be its own prison. He thought about her words, "It's too late now." Too late for what? For change? For choosing differently? Or was she saying it was too late to keep living as they had been, always looking over their shoulders, always measuring their happiness against others' expectations? The prince picked up the phone, then set it down. What could he say that hadn't been said? What promises could he make that wouldn't sound hollow after years of putting duty first? He needed to act, not speak. But action required courage, and courage meant potentially disappointing those who expected him to always choose the crown over the heart. Meanwhile, at Ray Mill House, Camilla sat in her garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her phone remained silent. She hadn't expected him to call immediately. Charles always needed time to process, to weigh options, to consider implications. It was both his strength and his weakness. She thought about the letter from her grandson that had prompted this confrontation. Such an innocent question from a child who couldn't understand why his grandmother was sometimes treated differently than other grandmothers. How could she explain that love sometimes came with a price tag that took decades to pay? Her mind wandered to all the time she had stood slightly behind Charles at public events, careful not to overshadow, always aware of her place in the hierarchy of things. The careful choreography of their public life, designed to show unity while acknowledging the complicated past. She was tired of the dance. But more than that, she was tired of seeing the man she loved trapped between his heart and his heritage. Every decision filtered through the lens of public perception, every gesture weighed against potential criticism. It wasn't the life either of them had envisioned when they first met at that polo match, young and full of possibilities. The phone rang, startling her from her reverie. It wasn't Charles. It was Princess and his sister, one of the few royals who had always treated Camilla with straightforward respect. "I heard you left rather dramatically this morning," and said without preamble, typical of her direct style. "News travels fast," Camilla replied. "It's the palace. News travels at the speed of light." There was a pause. "Are you all right?" Camilla considered the question. Was she all right? She had just delivered what amounted to an ultimatum to the future King of England, the man she had loved for most of her adult life. She had walked out of the palace with no clear plan for what came next. "I'm tired," and she admitted. "Tired of being careful. About time," and responded, surprising her. "You've been careful for 20 years. Maybe it's time to be something else." After they hung up, Camilla reflected on Anne's words. What would it mean to be something other than careful? To stop considering every angle, every possible interpretation, every potential criticism? Could she and Charles find a way to simply be themselves, without the constant weight of history on their shoulders? Back at the palace, Charles had retreated to his private apartment. He dismissed his valet, needing solitude to think. The rooms felt empty without Camilla's presence. Her reading glasses on the side table, her favorite tea in the kitchen, the indent on her side of the bed, all reminders of the life they had built together despite the odds. He picked up a photograph from their wedding day. They both looked so happy, finally able to publicly declare what they had felt for so long. But even then, the happiness was tempered with caution. The service had been a civil ceremony, not the grand church wedding befitting a future king. Camilla had worn a beautiful dress, but not a tiara. Every detail carefully calibrated to avoid giving offense. Had they been so focused on not offending that they had forgotten to truly live? Charles thought about his sons, William and Harry, and how differently they had approached love. William had chosen Catherine, waited until he was sure, and then moved forward without looking back. Harry had chosen Meghan, and damn the consequences. Both had made their choices and lived with them for better or worse. But their father, remained caught between worlds. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to honor Diana's memory, he might have dishonored the living woman who stood by his side. Camilla had never asked him to forget Diana, never competed with a ghost. She had simply asked to be loved without caveat, and even that it seemed too much to give at times. As night fell over London, the palace took on its evening routine. Guards changed shifts, staff prepared for the next day's events, and life continued its regimented pattern. But in his apartment, Charles sat with the weight of decision. He thought about calling his mother, the Queen, seeking her counsel. But what could she tell him that he didn't already know? That duty came first? That the crown demanded sacrifice? He had heard those lessons all his life. But at what point did sacrifice become self-destruction? Instead, he called William. His elder son answered on the second ring, concerned by the late call. "Is everything all right, Pa?" "Camilla's gone to Ray Mill," Charles said simply. There was a pause. "I see. Is this permanent?" "I don't know." The admission cost him. "William, how do you do it? How do you balance everything?" His son's voice was gentle when he replied. "I don't think about balance, Pa. I think about what matters most. Catherine and the children, they're not separate from my duty. They're my duty. The rest follows from that." After they spoke, Charles sat in the darkness, processing his son's words. When had he started seeing love and duty as opposing forces rather than complementary ones? When had he accepted that his personal happiness must always be sacrificed on the altar of public perception? He picked up his phone and scrolled through messages. Advisors warning about potential media storms, staff asking about schedule changes, the usual machinery of royal life grinding on. But nothing from the one person whose message he wanted to see. At Ray Mill House, Camilla couldn't sleep. She wandered through her home, touching familiar objects, grounding herself in this space that was entirely hers. No protocol here, no careful staging. Just a woman in her sanctuary, wondering if she had just ended the most important relationship of her life. She thought about calling him, about taking back her words. It would be so easy to return, to slip back into the familiar pattern of patience and understanding. But something had shifted that morning. Maybe it was her grandson's innocent question, or maybe it was simply the accumulation of years of being almost, but not quite fully accepted. Whatever it was, she couldn't unknow what she now knew. That continuing as they would slowly erode whatever remained of her sense of self. The next morning brought no resolution. Charles attended his scheduled engagements, smiling and waving, the perfect picture of royal duty. But those who knew him well noticed the strain around his eyes, the mechanical nature of his interactions. Camilla remained at Ray Mill, tending her garden, refusing all calls except from her children. The media, sensing drama, began to circle. "Trouble in Paradise?" one headline asked. "Royal sources report tension," claimed another. The palace press office issued standard denials, but the speculation continued. In the age of social media, every royal movement was analyzed, every absence noted. It was Princess and who finally broke the stalemate. She arrived at Ray Mill unannounced, striding through the garden gate with characteristic determination. "Enough of this," she declared, finding Camilla pruning roses. "You've made your point." "Have I?" Camilla asked, not looking up from her work. "And what point would that be?" "That you're not a doormat." Message received. "Now what?" Camilla set down her pruning shears and really looked at her sister-in-law, and had always been direct, sometimes brutally so. But she had also been fair, accepting Camilla into the family without the reservations that others had harbored. "I don't know," Camilla admitted. "I just know I can't go back to the way things were." "Then don't," and said simply, "change them." "It's not that simple, isn't it?" and challenged. "You spent 2 decades being what everyone else needed you to be. Patient Camilla, understanding Camilla, never complaining Camilla. Maybe it's time to be the Camilla that Charles fell in love with in the first place." That evening, Charles surprised everyone by canceling his evening engagement. Instead, he drove himself to Ray Mill House, arriving as the sun was setting. He found Camilla in the garden, where, and had left her hours earlier. You drove yourself, she observed, noting the absence of security, of drivers, of the usual retinue that followed him everywhere. I needed to think, he said. Driving helps me think. They stood there, feet apart, but miles distant, two people who had weathered every storm together, now facing their greatest challenge. The question of whether love could finally, truly conquer all. I've been thinking about what you said, Charles began. About it being too late. You're right. It is too late. Too late to keep living with one foot in the past. Too late to keep apologizing for choosing happiness. Too late to pretend that duty and love can't coexist. Camilla remained silent, waiting. I can't promise to change overnight, he continued. I've been molded by this life, shaped by expectations I didn't choose but accepted. But I can promise to try. To put us first, not as a betrayal of duty, but as a fulfillment of it. And what does that mean practically? She asked, ever pragmatic. It means no more careful choreography, no more measured responses. When I become king, you'll be my queen, not in spite of our history, but because of it. We've earned the right to stop apologizing. Camilla studied his face, looking for the certainty she needed. And if they never fully accept it, if there's always that segment that sees me as the other woman, then they'll have to live with their disapproval, Charles said firmly. I'm done living with it for them. It was a declaration of independence from the man who had always been bound by duty. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, measuring the distance between what was and what could be. I need more than words, Charles, Camilla finally said. I need actions. Then, let me start with this, he replied, taking her hand. Come back with me tonight. Not sneaking in the back entrance, not with careful timing to avoid cameras. Drive back with me, openly, and let them see that the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall are united unapologetically and completely. It was a small gesture in a grand scheme of things, but symbols mattered in their world. Camilla knew that returning with him openly, without the usual careful staging, would send a message. The question was whether she was ready to send it. And tomorrow, she asked, tomorrow we start living like we have nothing to hide, and nothing to apologize for, he said. Because we don't. Camilla felt something shift inside her, a loosening of bonds she hadn't even realized were there. For so long, she had accepted the narrative that their love was something to be managed, contained, presented carefully to avoid giving offense. But what if Charles was right? What if they had earned the right to simply be? All right, she said finally, but we do this properly. No half measures. No half measures, he agreed. As they walked back to the house together, Camilla reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From young lovers separated by circumstance, to middle-aged scandal, to elderly acceptance, they had paid every price that could be asked. Perhaps it was finally time to collect what was owed, the right to love without caveat. The drive back to London was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. Charles drove, while Camilla sat beside him, no longer in the carefully orchestrated separate arrivals that had marked so many of their public appearances. When they reached the palace gates, photographers were waiting, having been alerted by the unusual sight of the prince driving himself. Instead of ducking down or looking away, Camilla met their gaze directly. Let them photograph this, the Duke and Duchess together, returning home like any other couple after a disagreement. The pictures would make the morning papers, but for once, she didn't care about the headlines. Inside the palace, staff noticed the change immediately. The Duchess walked beside the Duke, not behind him. They entered their apartment together, openly affectionate in a way that had always been carefully modulated before. It was subtle, but significant, a shift in the very air around them. That night, as they prepared for bed, Charles turned to Camilla. You said it was too late. Too late for what exactly? She considered the question, thinking back to that morning that seemed so long ago now. Too late to keep living someone else's version of our story, she said. But perhaps not too late to write our own ending. Not an ending, Charles corrected gently. A new chapter. The next morning brought the expected media storm. Photos of their return dominated the front pages. United Front declared one headline. Camilla and Charles, stronger than ever, questioned another. But For once, neither of them reached for the papers with anxiety. The narrative was what it was. They had more important things to focus on. At the morning briefing, Charles announced a series of changes. Joint appearances would no longer be carefully choreographed to minimize Camilla's presence. She would take on more prominent roles in state occasions. Most significantly, when the time came for him to be king, she would be his queen consort in every sense of the word, without asterisks or qualifications. The advisors, predictably, worried about public reaction. There were still those who held onto grievances from the past, who would never accept Camilla fully. Charles listened to their concerns, then made a decision that would have been unthinkable even days before. "The public will accept what we present as normal," he said firmly. "We spent 2 decades acting as if we need permission to be together. That ends now." Camilla, sitting beside him in the meeting, felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in years: pride in their relationship, untainted by the need to minimize or apologize. This was the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, confident and decisive when he allowed himself to be. The changes were subtle at first, but significant. At their next public engagement, Camilla walked beside Charles, not behind him. She spoke freely to the press, no longer careful to avoid topics that might be considered controversial. When asked about her role as future queen consort, she answered simply, "I'll do my best to serve the country and support my husband." That's what partners do. The reaction was mixed, as expected. Die-hard critics voiced their disapproval, but many others expressed admiration for what they saw as authenticity. Editorial writers noted the confidence in Camilla's bearing, the ease between the couple that came from no longer performing their relationship for public consumption. But the real test came at a state banquet, where foreign dignitaries and British establishment figures gathered. In the past, Camilla's placement had always been carefully calculated, prominent enough to acknowledge her role, but not so prominent as to overshadow. This time, she sat exactly where a future queen consort should sit, without apology or explanation. During the dinner, the visiting head of state turned to Camilla and asked, with genuine curiosity, about her journey. Instead of the carefully rehearsed response she might have given before, she spoke honestly about the challenges and rewards of finding love later in life, about the importance of persistence, about learning that public opinion, while important, couldn't be the only measure of a life well lived. Charles, overhearing the conversation, felt a surge of admiration for this woman who had weathered every storm with him. Her honesty was more powerful than any carefully crafted message could have been. Later that evening, as they returned to their apartment, Camilla noticed something different about the palace itself. The staff, usually so formal, seemed more relaxed around them. There were genuine smiles, not just the professional courtesy that had marked their interactions before. It was as if by claiming their right to be themselves, they had given everyone else permission to be more authentic as well. "Do you regret the years we spent being careful?" Charles asked as they sat together, still in their formal wear, but finally able to relax. "No," Camilla said after considering. "I think we needed that time. We needed to prove to ourselves as much as anyone that this was real, that it could endure. But I'm glad we're done with it." As the weeks passed, the new normal established itself. Camilla took on more patronages, choosing causes that reflected her passions rather than what was expected. She spoke at conferences about domestic violence, used her platform to promote literacy, and never once checked whether her activities might overshadow other royal events. The public response evolved too. Younger generations, who had no memory of the scandals of the past, saw simply a couple devoted to each other and to service. Older critics remained, but their voices grew quieter, drowned out by the simple reality of 2 people doing their jobs with dedication and authenticity. One afternoon, Camilla's grandson came to visit at the palace. As they walked through the gardens, he asked her, "Grandma, do people still say mean things about you?" She knelt down to his level, considering how to answer. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but you know what? That's okay. Not everyone has to like us. What matters is that we know who we are and that we try to do good things. And Grandpa Charles loves you, The boy added matter-of-factly. Yes, Camilla smiled. And Grandpa Charles loves me. It was that simple and that complicated. Love had brought them together, kept them together through scandal and separation, and now, finally, allowed them to stand together without apology. As she watched her grandson run ahead to explore the garden maze, Camilla thought about the journey from that morning when she had said, "It's too late now." Those words had shattered the careful construct of their lives. But from the pieces, they had built something stronger, a partnership based not on managing perceptions, but on truth. Charles found her there later, standing in the garden where their story had nearly ended. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, using the phrase that had become their private joke over the years. "I was thinking about breaking points," she replied. "How sometimes things need to shatter before they can be rebuilt properly." "And are we properly rebuilt?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "We're getting there," she said, taking his hand, one authentic day at a time. As they walked back to the palace together, past the perfectly manicured gardens and the ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas, Camilla reflected on the power of those 4 words that had changed everything. It's too late now. They had been a declaration of independence, a refusal to continue living by others' rules, and ultimately, a catalyst for the freedom they now enjoyed. The palace, which had once felt like a beautiful prison, now felt like home. Not because the walls had changed, but because she and Charles had changed within them. They had stopped trying to fit into a narrative written by others and had begun writing their own. That evening, as state papers required attention and royal duties called, they worked side by side in the study. No longer careful about appearances, no longer measuring every gesture against potential criticism. Just 2 people who had loved each other through the best and worst of times, finally, free to simply be. The echoes of Camilla's words that morning, "It's too late now," had indeed shattered something. But from that shattering had come not destruction, but liberation. It was too late to live carefully, too late to apologize for their love, too late to be anything other than authentically themselves. And in that acceptance of what was too late, they had found what was perfectly timed, the freedom to love without reservation, to serve without apology, and to face whatever future awaited them as true partners, no longer in the shadows, but standing together in the light.